I'm going to try and take us now into a slightly different world, the world of the people of most of Asia, almost all of sub-Saharan Africa, and large parts of Latin America. Now, of these people, something like 20% are living on less than $1.25 purchasing power parity per day. And there are more than that, again, below $2. So a lot of very poor people. I want to say that the incidence of poverty in the developing world is roughly half now what it was in 1980. And these are not bad numbers, so there has been quite substantial improvement. The interesting thing is, how has that improvement been brought about, and how does it relate to what you want and what you're asking about in respect of a new economy? Well, the small family farm is a natural, voluntary producer cooperative. It competes in the marketplace. It doesn't do what the state tells it or ask the state what it believes, but it is a producer cooperative. And if that producer cooperative has a dynamic, changing, improving science base, which improves the capacity for farming, and particularly does so in a way that is consistent with not severe resource depletion. And if those producer cooperatives also have a state and social infrastructure which makes it possible for them to grow and function, they can do extremely well, and they can transform societies. And the so-called Asian miracle, the secret about the Asian miracle that very few people tell you, is that almost all those countries had dramatic, smallholder-based production growth first, creating the surpluses which allow growth in the rest of the economy, and that, in most cases, was assisted by quite dramatic land reform. Don't let people tell you that no land reform happens, it's all evaded. That's a long story, but this is very much a part of the story of development. There's a standard narrative now among agricultural development economists, a group to which I belong, which is rather different from that of the rest of the profession. The development economics miracles of Asia arise from scientific, smallholder agricultural intensification. And this is a win-win sector, because the things that generate a lot of growth of output do so by generating also more demand for labour, more demand for workplaces, whether on family farms or in agricultural employment. So growth and poverty reduction go together. And if you look at the early years of the Green Revolution, even in China, inequality was static or falling, and there was really dramatic poverty reduction. And that was very much the case also in South Asia. These are countries and regions with substantial pressures against poverty reduction and inequality reduction. Nevertheless, the small farm emphasis made it possible for these things to be brought about. So it's win-win also, not only between agriculture and the rest of the economy, but within agriculture. Because where there is a lot of labour per hectare and very few sources of profitable income, of profitable use of that labour by the owners of the land, who are usually the same people, small farms are actually more socially efficient. Because the cost of looking after the labour force is much less if you're the labour force yourself. It's you and your family, and maybe a couple of hired labourers, and who knows, next week or next season you may be working for them just as they're now working for you. In those circumstances, the transactions costs of looking after that labour, recruiting it, supervising it, screening it, those costs are much less than they are for a big farm. Now, if you're in a country where production is anyway using a lot of labour and not much capital, there are natural advantages to smallness in the sense of labour supervision. If you're in the United States, small farms, I regret to say, have many disadvantages, because farming is very substantially about borrowing and about capital management of large units. So in the United States, and indeed in Europe and Australia, you don't find large farms doing well. In the developing world, there's actually been a shift of land from large farms towards small farms. You look at successive agricultural censuses in Asia and Africa, and you see farmers voting with their feet to get that land into small farms. So this has been a terrific success story in Asia, where the science base and the social and state base to support small-scale agriculture have been present. It's not been a success story in sub-Saharan Africa, where the science base and the state support have been absent. But anyway, can Africa duplicate that? Well, the great threat, as we see it, is resource depletion, huge, horrendous soil losses, losses of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash in African soils. And on top of that, global warming, higher evaporation rates, more uncertainty of rainfall. Does that threaten this extremely promising success story of agriculture first poverty reduction? That's what the question that I want to raise. What can be done about that? Well, I've mentioned, let me first explain what the threat is. Water, more evaporation, more variability, more unpredictability of rainfall timing and onset. And agriculture is already in these countries getting over 80% of all the water that is used commercially. By commercially, I mean including small farms that are self-consuming, not only by people who are selling. But agriculture is already the big water user. There's very little irrigation in Africa yet. There's an awful lot in Asia, which has been part of the secret of its success. But that is threatened, or seems to be threatened, by water shortages, including those created by global warming. Now, what about the other big threat to natural resources, which is that energy costs are going up, oil and fossil fuels are getting scarcer, and these are the feedstocks for fertilizer, so that a fertilizer water-based green revolution, as happened so successfully in Asia based on small farms, seems to be less feasible, seems to be more of a problem now than it was then. Well, I'd like to suggest that smallholders have a big advantage here too, that there's a lot that they can do because it pays them to do it. Smallholders, as I say, have low supervision costs, search costs, screening costs relating to labour. It pays them, they want to put in more labour per hectare than large farmers who have to supervise and screen the labour do. And that's why there's so much work showing that small farmers in developing countries are getting more output per hectare than large. Well, how does that advantage operate in the case of saving water, saving energy, saving fertilizer at a time of global warming and resource pressure? Well, let me first talk about water. Drip irrigation, which means managing very small quantities of water so that they get to the root zone at the right time, is a small farm activity. Organising it over a large space is extremely difficult from the viewpoint of labour supervision. Drip irrigation for small farmers has begun already to be a great success, greatly economising on water use in Maharashtra in India, treadle pump irrigation in Bangladesh, and quite a lot of successful examples in Africa too. Finally, fertiliser. In order to make better use of fertiliser, you need split applications, not just putting in all the fertiliser at once, but splitting the applications. You need to place the fertiliser more accurately, and, very important, you need to know your plot in detail so that you know how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, how much potash, also soil micronutrients like zinc are needed where. And then to have the labour to do that sort of thing and benefit from it. And again, the smallholder with low labour transactions costs wins there. If there is the scientific infrastructure, which almost always needs public sector infrastructure, to provide small-scale soil-based and water-based information. And that is developing enormously in South and East Asia now. So, summarising, yes, small farming has been at the heart of the successful poverty reduction and growth of Asia. And that can work in Africa too, with certain requirements. There is a serious threat, not just to agriculture, but to all sectors. It certainly works in agriculture, a serious threat of resource depletion, which makes energy and fertilizer dearer, water scarcer and more unreliable, which makes that green revolution harder to achieve. But if we recognize that threat, and if the state organizes its resources to help poor small farmers deal with it, smallholders have a very good chance of getting over that hump and of making a cost-effective use of the resources, even in the time of difficulty created by global warming and other resource pressures.